The moment of breaking point. Every conflict, whether personal, political, or geopolitical, has a moment where the pressure reaches an unbearable threshold. That instant, when tolerance collapses, is often described as the last straw. The phrase implies that there were many preceding provocations, injustices, or tensions, but one specific event, seemingly small in isolation, pushes the situation into irreversible escalation. The heading, "It happened. It was the last straw. They put me in a dead end," reflects exactly such a critical moment, where a cornered actor, individual, or state no longer sees compromise as viable and begins to consider actions that were previously unthinkable. To understand such a breaking point, we must first consider the psychology behind endurance. People, societies, and even nations endure hardship, confrontation, and pressure for prolonged periods. There is often an instinct to avoid drastic action until every other possibility has been tested. However, endurance has limits. Once all available space for maneuver is exhausted, the sense of being trapped in a dead end intensifies. That perception itself becomes the catalyst for radical transformation. Historically, this concept can be seen in countless turning points. In politics, nations pushed into isolation or sanctions often behave more aggressively, not less. Leaders facing internal opposition sometimes consolidate power rather than retreat. Similarly, individuals under personal or professional pressure may resist for long periods, but when the last straw is added, the reaction can be disproportionate compared to the immediate trigger. This is not irrational, it is the natural outcome of accumulated grievances and shrinking alternatives. The phrase, "they put me in a dead end," highlights another crucial dimension: responsibility. The subject is not claiming to have voluntarily chosen a desperate path but instead points to external forces, they, who engineered or contributed to the trap. This framing shifts the narrative from weakness to inevitability. In geopolitics, states often adopt this rhetoric: "we were left with no choice but to act." Dead ends are not always real, sometimes, they are perceived. But perception carries the same weight as reality. If someone believes there is no exit, they will act as though there is none. This makes narratives powerful tools. Opponents may create the impression of a cornered situation to manipulate behavior, while leaders may amplify the dead end story to mobilize support. Ultimately, the last straw is dangerous precisely because it is unpredictable. The buildup is visible: tension, pressure, frustration, but no one can predict exactly which event will trigger collapse. And once collapse arrives, it rewrites the rules. The anatomy of pressure and manipulation. To be pushed into a dead end requires more than one event, it is the culmination of multiple forces. Pressure, whether political, economic, or psychological, functions like layers of weight placed on a fragile structure. The structure may hold for some time, but every new layer increases the risk of collapse. Understanding how these pressures accumulate reveals why the last straw feels both sudden and inevitable. At the heart of pressure is manipulation. External actors, the they, in our heading, often apply deliberate strategies to limit another party's freedom of choice. In politics, this may come in the form of sanctions, diplomatic isolation, or military encirclement. In personal life, it may manifest as social expectations, economic debt, or workplace hierarchies that restrict individual autonomy. The strategy is the same: reduce the available options until the target sees only one narrow path. However, pressure does not act in isolation, it interacts with human psychology. People respond differently to adversity. Some adapt, some resist, and some collapse. What determines the outcome is often the perception of fairness and control. If individuals or states believe they still have agency, they can tolerate more hardship. But once they feel trapped, that is, once the dead end perception takes hold, even moderate pressure can ignite explosive reactions. History is filled with examples. When empires imposed excessive taxation without representation, revolutions followed. When authoritarian regimes pushed dissenters too far, underground movements turned into mass uprisings. The mechanics are consistent. Control applied too tightly backfires. The oppressor sees obedience, while the oppressed see entrapment. That tension eventually produces the last straw moment. In today's interconnected world, manipulation has expanded into subtler forms: economic leverage, information warfare, and technological dependence. Countries rely on global markets and networks, which makes them vulnerable to being cornered by trade restrictions or digital sabotage. Similarly, Individuals dependent on online platforms for work or identity can feel cornered when those systems fail or turn hostile. Modern dead ends may not look like physical traps, but they function with the same logic. Thus, the anatomy of pressure is clear. It builds silently, relies on limiting options, and depends on creating a sense of inevitability. Yet, paradoxically, the very act of cornering someone increases the likelihood that they will resist with greater force. The last straw is always planted by accumulation, but harvested by desperation. Reactions at the edge of desperation. When placed in a dead end, reactions tend to diverge into two extremes, submission or explosion. Some actors collapse under pressure, resigning to their fate. Others resist with unprecedented strength, fueled by the conviction that nothing worse can happen. It is this latter reaction that makes the last straw so transformative and so dangerous. On a personal level, desperation breeds innovation or rebellion. Individuals who believe they have nothing left to lose often take risks they would never consider in calmer circumstances. History shows that great inventions, movements, and revolutions frequently emerge from such desperation. Conversely, so do acts of violence, sabotage, and self-destruction. For nations, the stakes are even higher. A state that feels encircled militarily may strike first, believing that delay only worsens its position. Economically isolated nations often pursue radical self-sufficiency or aggressive alliances, reshaping entire geopolitical landscapes. The Cuban Missile Crisis, for example, was born out of one nation's refusal to accept a position of entrapment. Reactions also depend on leadership. Leaders play a critical role in shaping how societies interpret dead ends. A skilled leader may frame desperation as an opportunity, channeling frustration into unity and resilience. A reckless leader may exploit anger, directing it toward aggression. Either way, the rhetoric of, "we were pushed into a corner," serves as justification for otherwise controversial actions. Importantly, desperation rarely ends in neutrality. It creates new realities. Revolutions overthrow governments, wars redraw borders, social movements force systemic reforms. In this sense, the dead end is never truly an end, it is a crossroads disguised as finality. Once someone feels cornered, they must act, and their actions reverberate beyond themselves, reshaping the environment that trapped them. Thus, the moment of reaction, the strike back from the corner, is both a symptom of accumulated pressure and the birth of a new reality. The road beyond the dead end. Paradoxically, a dead end is not always the conclusion it appears to be. While the phrase suggests finality, human history shows that dead ends often serve as catalysts for transformation. They force rethinking, restructuring, and reimagining paths that were once invisible. For individuals, the experience of being cornered can become a turning point. Many personal success stories emerge from crisis. When people lose jobs, relationships, or security, they are often compelled to reinvent themselves. What seemed like a trap later reveals itself as the push needed for change. In geopolitics, the same dynamic plays out. Nations forced into isolation often accelerate their technological or military development. States pressured into alliances discover new strengths. Even revolutions, though chaotic, frequently give rise to new systems of governance. The dead end, in this sense, is not the destruction of choice but the rebirth of different choices. However, this transformation depends on vision. Without vision, a dead end produces collapse. With vision, it produces resilience. Leaders and individuals alike must recognize that desperation creates a rare clarity, a willingness to abandon old structures and attempt the unprecedented. If harnessed, this clarity can turn defeat into renewal. Thus, the heading, "It happened. It was the last straw. They put me in a dead end," is not only a lament but also a prophecy. It captures the pain of entrapment, the inevitability of reaction, and the hidden possibility of transformation. History's greatest shifts have come not from calm negotiation but from desperate moments where no exit seemed possible. The lesson is timeless. Dead ends are dangerous, but they are never absolute. Every corner forces a choice, and every choice reshapes the future. The last straw may break the old order, but in doing so, it often clears the ground for something entirely new.